Hello. Today I do want to talk to you a bit more about the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, particularly the First Amendment. Also, and the first 10 amendments are the Bill of Rights. Then we will also talk some about the Fifth Amendment and especially the 14th Amendment. So the First Amendment deals with freedom of speech and freedom of religion. So we will talk some about that. Then we will also talk about due process, and especially the 14th Amendment, which deals with due process. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection laws. The Equal Protection Clause is also very important. So let's talk about a few of these things. Now, as we've talked about, basic constitutional rights are not absolute. There are some fundamental concepts. However, we do have to remember they're not absolute. Now, I do want you to look back at something very briefly before we go further. Keep in mind that the First Amendment, for example, says Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise, or abridging the freedom of speech. It does not say your boss at your work cannot make a rule about this. So a good example might be if you want to go to work and wear a religious maybe a button or a political campaign button on your shirt, and you want to talk to people about your favorite political candidate or about your religion, your boss at work at a private place of business is not violating your First Amendment freedom of speech by telling you that you're not allowed to do that. Okay? So keep in mind that the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment is dealing with what the government, the limitations on the government and what they can do. It's not talking about a private business not being allowed to make certain rules for the workplace. So do keep that in mind. The purpose of the Bill of Rights was to keep the government from overreaching into private citizens' rights. So keep that in mind. All right, so let's talk back about this PowerPoint a little bit more. So the rights are not absolute, and we will look at public policy to decide what limitations can we have on things like freedom of speech. So First Amendment has freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and it also does protect commercial speech, and it has freedom of the press. Now, freedom of religion, there's two parts to this. One is the Establishment Clause. So if someone complains that at a public high school, a prayer that is a Christian prayer is done and supported by that high school to the exclusion of other religious prayers or no prayer at all, that is because of the Establishment Clause. The First Amendment says that the government shall make no law establishing a state religion, such as Christianity. And so public schools have an issue there if they try to establish a state religion by supporting or advertising only one religion. Also, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So most business-related freedom of religion cases involve the free exercise clause. And that clause is dealing with things like what if your employee says, I must take every Sunday off because that's a religious day for me? And maybe your business says, well, that's a problem because Sunday is our busiest day and other employees also want Sunday off. Businesses do have to deal with freedom of religion here. And normally what could happen is that the business must do some accommodation of an employee's religious beliefs but there is a limitation there on how far the employee can go with that. So the employee might get Sunday off once a month or once every 2 months or whatever is reasonable, but they're not entitled to have unlimited freedom of religion. Now, there's another amendment I want to mention, freedom of speech. That's also in the First Amendment. And it does not apply to actions of private companies. So if your boss says you cannot use or talk about your religion to my clients who come into our place of business, well, that's not a violation of freedom of speech because your boss is not the government. And the First Amendment freedom of speech is dealing with what can the government make you do or not make you do. It also, please know that it does cover verbal and written communication. It protects symbolic speech. So if someone decides they want to burn an American flag as a form of political speech to protest against the United States, that is protected speech. Now, there are some things that are not protected. Unprotected speech, such as fighting words or obscenity, are not protected. And figuring out what obscenity is may be a little tricky. But do remember that things like artistic works or medical books or things like that could be offensive to some people who do not approve of certain language, sexual language, or nudity, still may be protected under freedom of speech if it has artistic value or scientific value. But judges have a hard time sometimes figuring out what is unprotected obscenity, and it may be partly in the eye of the beholder. So policy can't be overbroad. That's something that you do need to know. So when government decides they're going to restrict speech or written or verbal expression or other types of expression, it does need to be narrowly drafted. We're not going to just shut down the speech, in other words, but there may be some regulations on the speech. So a good example might be a famous case. Let me find this one here. See if I can find it real quick. Here we go. Is Bad Frog Beer. And you can see they have kind of a label with a frog, kind of making a gesture that some might find offensive. And, there's been attempts by a state to say that you can't have this label on display because it looks kind of attractive to children, and yet we don't really want children imitating this frog or wanting to buy beer. However, this idea that you've just got to take off your label is basically too broad. There are much better ways to regulate this that don't completely shut down this expression of what this company wants to do. It could be regulated by saying it must be displayed at a higher level, not at child level or in a special part of the store. There's much better ways to regulate it than just to say you can't have the label. And so that's the issue there. So governmental restrictions on expression must be narrowly drafted, not too broad, or otherwise it violates the overbreadth doctrine and will be invalidated based on the First Amendment. All right. Let me get back to where we were. Now, a good example is Snyder versus Phelps. I will go back. I know I've just gotten out of the PowerPoint, but I'm going to go back. There's one other thing I want to show you, and that is Westboro Baptist Church. Here's some images of signs that they have carried in pickets at different funerals, oftentimes funerals for soldiers. God hates you, you're going to hell, Antichrist Obama, and so forth. Some very horrible things they're saying. God hates divorce. God hates adulterers. So forth. Basically saying that America, here's one, thank God for dead soldiers. That America is in trouble because of whatever this church believes is immoral, and therefore, they come to these funerals. And you can imagine if you're having a funeral for your dead son, who happened to be a soldier, and then this group comes to town and pickets because of your son's funeral. During the funeral, it's going to upset you quite a bit. So the father of this Marine, Lance Corporal Snyder, sued the church because of emotional distress and invasion of privacy. The question was, does the First Amendment prohibit holding Westboro Church liable for its speech? And the court said yes, that Westboro is not liable for this. Now, not everyone in the Supreme Court agreed with this decision. There was a dissent, but the court basically said, we're sorry this happened. However, we're going to basically hold that the First Amendment protects this church, even though they're doing something that most of us would find very offensive. The court said what they're talking about, even though we may disagree with it, is a matter of public concern, and they do address political and moral issues, broad public issues. So the speech was protected by the court. And the court said we're not going to expand the captive audience doctrine to such situations. The protesters stayed in the authorized location, away from the service, and the picketing did not disrupt the funeral service. And so even though the family knew it was going on, and it did hurt them, the court said the church speech was protected. Freedom of speech does protect commercial speech, not to the same extent as political speech. What the court will look at, if there is a substantial governmental interest involved, whether the law directly advances that interest, and if the restriction is no more extensive than necessary to serve the purpose. The Supreme Court does recognize that free commercial speech is essential for fair conduct of the public's right to know. A good example is the Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association case, and the issue there was that respondents that represented the video game and software industries filed a challenge to a California law. They were asked to determine the constitutionality of a California law prohibiting the sale or rental of violent video games to minors and requiring their packaging to be labeled. The court held that the law did not meet the requirements of strict scrutiny, and therefore the law was unconstitutional. So, the question, does the law restricting the sale or rental of violent video games to minors violate First Amendment protection? Well, yes, it does, because this is speech. Video games are a form of speech, and restricting the sale of this to minors was too broad, basically, and so the court said, we're going to strike this down. All right. I'm going to stop here and take a break, and I'll talk to you a bit later about a few other things that you need to know about the U.S. Constitution. Thank you.